from somewhere else? The flat answer was no, which was a lie, but nevertheless that was the answer.
Where'd you know him from?
He was the same guy that died on the Philadelphia experiment, the guy known as Bill Cody. I've been able to trace his history since. It's a long and bizarre history, but he wound up from the Eldridge in the 28th century, and eventually I wound up there. And he took me all over and got me involved as a tour guide, and apartments, housing, whatever, was rather plentiful and readily available. If you didn't like living in the cities, you could go out and make it on your own in the back country as a hermit or farmer or whatever. There were farms, but most farms were contained within certain city limits because the farms were contained. They didn't need the giant farms like we have today. The farming was contained, it was very well controlled, well irrigated, well nurtured, and so forth.
Was it still a small population?
500 million max for the world. In the United States, or what that territory I was in, which would have been part of the U.S., let's say for all of North America, which would include what was once Canada, from questions I asked, it was actually less than 100 million. There was more population in North America than almost anywhere else in the world at that time. So the principal concentration was still in North America.
Okay. So this computer basically said there's a mess in the past which you need to be sent to.
You have to go back to and straighten out.
Back and straighten
I don't want to go back. You have to go back. I kept insisting, I want to stay here. He said, you can't. I said, what do I have to go back to? You have to go back. It wouldn't give me a direct answer. So eventually I was sent back without my knowledge of how it was done or my say-so or my approval. I was just sent back. And I was sent back completely intact, of course, in terms of health, to 2137 to the hospital and meet with Duncan. And a short time after that, Duncan and I were transferred to the incident which I've described publicly so many times, 1983 at the Montauk Point thing at approximately 2 a.m. in the morning, and inside the perimeter of that military fence.
Let's go back to 2137 though, and the transfer. How did that happen? Was it just sort of a blink of the eyes, or was there a...
there was probably equipment involved, but I can only say probably because I have no recall of it. And what transpired in the last hours and minutes with Duncan and I there before we were transferred, I'm sure there was more to it than I remember, and what I remember of it is very blank. And it was then, as we went back to 1983, when we arrived at 1983, suddenly all our memories of the Philadelphia experiment and what we had just gone through were back, with largely a blank out of the 2137 and the 28th century phenomena. That did come back to some extent, but it came back later. And of course, in terms of Al-Bielek, it took a long time to get that back. But that was largely blanked out, but not totally blanked out. A little of it came filtering through after the sequence of returning to the Eldridge, destroying the equipment, because what they gave us instructions, of course, as I've covered from Neumann, destroy the equipment, whatever you have to do, just shut it off.
Let's go back now to Montauk, because that's where you landed.
Right.
Right. Both you and your brother landed there.
Right.
And you said it was a helicopter.
Helicopter overhead with a blinding searchlight.
Right. And okay, so they took you down in the underground caverns?
They took us in the underground part of Montauk, which had been built as part of Montauk specifically. In other words, they didn't go into a cavern section. We went into a artificially built section, which was where much of the work was done. A little lower was the caverns. We didn't go that far down.
So they were expecting you?
Neumann was expecting us because of the records from my report to him in 1943 of what had happened that I'd gone into the future. And it had been at the 1983 end of it. I told him all of that. He didn't really believe me, but sort of half believed me. But he said later, we're going to do something to prove this. But he had the records of what final report he wrote, so he knew what was probably going to happen. So quite literally, he was kept on the station as a consultant until this era would happen, if it was going to happen, other people going through the years in 1981, 82, 83 weren't quite sure whether something like this was really going to happen.
But they still had a greeting party ready for you.
Oh, yes, they had a party ready for us in case we arrived, which we did. And, of course, then we met Van Neumann, and Van Neumann told us the problem and so forth, and then, of course, we were shipped back to the Eldridge.
Well, let's go back, because we haven't really explored this one part.
Okay.
Here it is. You see Dr. Van Neumann. He's quite a bit older.
Quite a bit, 40 years older.
Than when you left.
Yes.
What was the shock that you experienced? And here he is, you see him.
I would say at first there was no shock because we didn't recognize him.
Mm-hmm.
And when he said, "I am Dr. John Van Neumann," the same one you knew in 1943, except I'm 40 years older, and you're at Montauk, Long Island, we didn't believe him. We told him, he said, "You can't be." And he said, "I am," and he was insistent on it. And he says, "Never mind, come with me." So he gave us the cook's tour of the underground, of the computers, and all of the various electronic systems, none of which existed in 43. And we were, shall we say, ogle-eyed at this stuff. And computers, people were talking about computers in 1943, and that's all they were doing, about what was going to happen after the war. We were going to have to do some entirely new computing techniques. They did have the analog computer at Harvard functional in 1943. They had some other calculating devices which were at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which were not computers, but they were calculators, very large electronic calculators. And they knew the day was coming for a computer which could do the computations automatically, but it was not there yet. But then we were confronted with it in 1983. And we see all these computers. And
were these IBM computers?
Yes, IBM 360s and 370s, plus the hard drives, plus the tape drives, plus everything else. And one of them even had a couple of card readers there. And all of the associated hardware feeding those computers, other computers feeding them, and, of course, the graphic displays they used. And, of course, after we got through all of that and some of the modern electronic equipment, a tour of the basement.
See, the interesting thing about that is that was the present state of technology.
At 1983.
Yeah, 1983, because I know IBM had just, I think, 84 announced the successor, which was the 4300 series.
Yeah, it came just a little later.
But you would think that they would have had perhaps even more advanced technology there.
They apparently didn't. Apparently they didn't in 83. An independent group had already split off from IBM, was working on the Cray computer that became a separate corporation, of course, very large.
Cray did that, right?
Yeah, and he was originally, I believe, an IBM employee, and this whole crew that went with him. And they did have a Cray 1 installed at Montauk prior to 83, I think about 78, 79. That was the first of a long series. The Cray 2 didn't come along until after 83, as I remember. We did not have a Cray 2 on board. And if we'd had a Cray 5 available, they wouldn't have had a problem. But we didn't.
Okay, so
they showed us all this.
Did they keep you in a room for a while, though?
They kept us in that room for a while, and we sort of looked at the equipment and so forth. Then they took us out to see other electronic equipment. They showed us... They did not show, if I remember correctly, they didn't show us the tunnel, not at first. They did later. I mean, in the first tour, there was a second tour later. In the first tour, they didn't show us the tunnel, but they showed us some of the hardware that went along with generating the tunnel. Some of the very high-powered equipment in the basement, as it were, the huge transformer, the huge amphitrons, and a lot of the other heavy equipment.
Now, why do you think they gave you the cook's tour?
To convince us, I believe, that we were in 1983 and not in 1943, and it was not a trick, and not an illusion.
Okay, and why was it important to convince you?
I suppose one could take a number of tacks on that. They had to convince us that it was real and not illusion, so that we wouldn't think we're in some kind of a nightmare or a dream, and say, "Oh, no, this isn't real." and refused to cooperate any further because they needed our cooperation desperately. So eventually we were convinced, but the thing that finally convinced us was sitting down in front of large screen color TV, which of course did not exist in 43. All we had is 10-inch